probably I'm speaking on behalf of the whole internet. It's actually, I'm somewhat flummoxed to some extent what I'm supposed to be talking about here, because following Gus's opening remarks and Ross's comments about costs and everything, I'm not really sure what I'm expecting out of the government in the Queen's speech. We've not been party to any specification of whether we expect to have a black box, whether we expect to pre-process any data before it gets into the black box. So I really come from a simple perspective of a simple ISP, because all ISPs do at the end of the day is provide internet services like surfing and access to other parts of the internet, and email services, and to some extent voice. So I'm looking at really from the simplistic perspective, being asked to say, can we do it at what cost? And I've added some real more important points, I think, in terms of whether whatever we do will be effective and what might be the consequences of what we do. So, can we do it? Well, I did say, can we do what? But almost, if you can think about it, we can do anything in the internet world. In China, I'm sure they do a lot of surveillance along the same lines that we've been asked to consider here. And so if we look at breaking it down, things like voice and telephone calls, they're fairly straightforward. There's an element of whether it has to be real time or not, because whilst we collect all the right data for billing, we don't do it in a real time manner, and so there's a systems development issue associated with that. Email, so it's fairly straightforward to gather the kind of email, who sent who what, without having to dig into the content, because that type of information appears on our systems on a sort of secondary basis. And the same for web. It's pretty easy for us, I'm sure, to provide access to which websites for access. When it comes to drilling down into individual protocols such as Twitter, then you do have to start getting into traffic management techniques. And whilst some ISPs traffic manage, all the big ISPs do, most of the small ISPs don't traffic manage because it's a very expensive thing to do, and you don't necessarily have the same return on investment because of the lack of scale. Okay. But even with traffic management, whilst you can identify which protocols are being used and coming from which IP addresses, then there's be quite a bit of development needed to translate that into something useful to correlate with, for example, a CRM database to say who's at that IP address. Okay. So a lot of it can be done. Costs, Ross mentioned 2 billion. We really have no idea what the costs are going to be. I think if you look at an entry-level traffic management system, you're looking at between 100 and 200,000 pounds. There are 210 members of the ISP association plus 2 ISPs who are not members. So you could say you can work out for yourself what just in terms of cost of kit might be. Memory's cheap, as we've mentioned. I bought a terabit drive for 54 quid. You can store a lot of data on there. A lot of the costs actually are not really associated with the hardware. They're associated with the costs of implementing the systems that allow you to make use of the hardware. I guess some of the other issues associated with whether you're asking, because traditionally in this country, it's only the big ISPs that are asked to implement certain regulations. So the Digital Economy Act, for example, wasn't deemed cost effective for most ISPs to have to enforce the Digital Economy Act. And I think that's, to a large extent, been the same right across the patch with other legislations. But it's fairly straightforward for a large ISP to implement some of these rules, because they've already done the systems work. But from a small ISP perspective, these guys often don't have systems. Instead of having one email server, you may find they'll have 10 different email servers. As an ISP ourselves, I've spent a couple of years going from having 8 email platforms, because we'd acquired different ISPs over the years, to just having one so that it was more manageable. So there's a huge undefined hidden cost in having to implement what actually you don't know what we're having to be implemented. And there's also the ongoing cost of managing this? Do we have to have one dedicated person who's an expert in supporting the government, the GCHQ? Or do we actually have to do any of these things because the black box will take care of everything? I really don't know. So, the next point really is, okay, I can say, what price avoiding 9/11 again? I think if it was £2 billion for us to never have another 9/11, that would be money well spent, I think. I think the real issue is whether whatever gets put in place is effective. And there's a question from the floor, Google. As far as I'm concerned, we can't see any of the traffic going, or we know that it's going to Google. It's encrypted. If you log onto your Google account, you see HTTPS. You would have to get Google in the room to be able to do anything with that, unless someone's telling me that in the middle of this black box there's some fantastic unencryption software that can handle all that. But I'm sure that's something that would be very visible to the end user. The other thing then is it's so easy to avoid some of the blocks the surveillance that we're talking about. We all probably in this room understand what you can do with proxy servers and the encryption of your web browsing, so that you can anonymously browse the web. You might, instead of sending someone an email, you may say, well, I'll use Dropbox, or I'll use a Google Doc. I'll leave a message in a Google Doc for someone else to go and read and delete afterwards. There are all these ways, loads of ways I'm sure that I can't even think of, that what people could use to get around any surveillance. And if we just simplistically look at what's happening with the IWF model, then I think it's reasonably accepted that the IWF filtering actually doesn't stop any people who really want to access this illegal child molesting material. So it's whether really whatever is put in place has any effectiveness and really catches the people who are undoubtedly out there trying to break the laws. And then to finish off, I think some of these other things have been mentioned elsewhere, but I mean, by creating this environment and driving people to what it might term as an underground culture of using the web anonymously, and it's quite tempting actually, with all the, someone mentioned Google Ads, and it's frightening the amount of stuff that people actually know about your web surfing. But if you just say, I mentioned the Digital Economy Act, if you just say, if the country is driven to a culture of using proxy servers and surfing anonymously, then there's no way that anybody would ever find out whether the Digital Economy Act is effective or not, because you would not be able to tell who's stopping downloading copyrighted material. And then finally, I guess, there's the whole subject of what ISPs are being asked to do generally. We're talking about surveillance here, but web blocking, Digital Economy Act had an element of web blocking in the debate as well. We've seen Claire Perry's announcement yesterday, was it the child pornography? It's where does the spec creep stop, and at which point we